So now I'd like to call Mike back to the stage, and we have some of your questions that we're going to challenge Mike with. If any of you have any more questions that you would like to ask, feel free to hold up your cue card, or you can give it to one of the volunteers in the back, and they will bring it to the front for us to read.
You want to say something about that? Whatever that is that's called in that.
Oh, sound booth. We've got a buzzing going on up here on stage. Is it possible to cut that, get that cut off? Is it just me, or can anyone else hear a buzzing? Yeah? Okay. So I'm not the only one? Sorry, I'm just looking to the... Can I get a sign from the sound booth? Oh, they're working on it. Okay, sorry. Well...
It's this right here.
We found the culprit. Can I get applause for the tech team? Okay, we have an awesome team here at Foothills Alliance. They do a great job, so thank you to them. Okay, Mike, are you ready?
I guess so. We'll see.
Okay. Well, here is your first question. During your time of doubt, how did the people closest to you help you through it? Did they react a certain way or say certain things that made you see or understand that doubt was okay?
That's a good question. Well, my wife was the closest one to me, and she was patient with me. I mean, she didn't like it that I was going through this period of doubt, but she knew that that's the way I was wired, and that she knows me. I'm after truth, and I got to find it. And it doesn't matter what the costs are to find the truth, or even after I get truth. I need to know truth, and I need to follow it. It's just who I am. So she knew it was a road that I needed to go down. So she was kind to me in that way and patient. Gary Habermas, William Lane Craig knew about it. They were close mentors, and they were patient with me, never put me down for it. My doctoral supervisor knew that I was going through it. I didn't really share it with too many people at all, just some of the closest people to me, because I didn't want them to struggle. But my doctoral supervisor, he was patient and never put me down for it. So those that I did share it with were just really kind and good to me along the way.
Okay, thank you for that. Next, how would you help or advise a non-Christian who doubts God exists because of tragedies that they have experienced in their life?
Well, I would try to empathize, sympathize with them as much as possible. And not to put them down for it. And, I learned from a friend a long time ago a simple thing called the feel, felt, found. And, it's just, and you do it with sincerity, of course. It's not just a technique, but it's just a way to respond to them that's simple, easy to remember, but you do it with sincerity. Feel, felt, found. I know exactly how you feel. There have been times when I have felt the same way, but here's what I found. And of course, you just fill in so I know exactly how you feel. I felt the same way at times. I went through a period when God let me down. Let me tell you about one of those experiences, but here's what I found. That doesn't do anything to change the evidence. And God's will in our life isn't our happiness, it's our holiness. And a lot of times that means going through difficult situations. So, so there's fuller answers that you can give, but I typically follow that feel, felt, found.
Okay, thank you. Can you outline basic arguments against Islam and Buddhism? Just a quick question.
Quick answer, right? Hang on a second.
We got lots of time, so.
I've got a sneeze coming up here. Oh.
I have no witty filler to put in there, so.
Okay. So, for Islam, what I will do, I was saying this to a couple people before coming out here, some back in the room. for Islam, I do think it's one of the most easily refuted religions in the world. And there's a number of ways I go after it. One thing I do is what's called the Islamic catch-22 argument. And so one of the things about Islam is they say that Jesus never died. And that's based on the Quran's teaching in Surah 4, that God only made it appear that he died, but he never died. And so I say, well, I give 3 historical reasons for believing that Jesus actually predicted his death. It's not based on the historical reliability of the Gospels or their divine inspiration. It's using pure historical method and an approach, and say we can show historically that Jesus predicted his imminent death. Now, if Jesus didn't die, then that makes him a false prophet. But the Quran says that he's a great prophet, so in that case, the Quran would be wrong. The other option is that Jesus did die, but in that case, the Quran says he didn't, so the Quran is wrong there. Either way, the Quran is mistaken. So the Muslim is caught between the proverbial rock and a hard place, and the only way out of that is to say, well, Jesus never predicted his death. And I said, well, I've given you 3 historical reasons for believing that he did. You have to refute all 3 of those. You just can't say, oh, I don't believe it. Give me some reasons why not to believe it, other than, well, it doesn't bode well with your worldview. And that way you're being guided by your biases, not by the data. And that's a difficult position to be in. When you say, I'm not going to listen to the data, I'm not going to listen to the facts, don't confuse me with them, because that's not the way I was raised. So that's one thing I say to the Muslim. A second thing I say is, look, we can prove historically that Jesus' disciples were going out, they sincerely believed and were preaching that Jesus rose from the dead and had appeared to them. Even atheist and agnostic New Testament scholars who study the subject agree such, that the evidence is good enough to suggest that beyond a reasonable doubt. So we can understand, if the Quran is correct, why God would want to deceive Jesus' enemies into thinking that he had died but didn't. But why would God want to deceive the followers of Jesus? And as a result, form the largest religion in the world. Doesn't seem too wise of God, right? And the Quran, on a number of occasions, refers to Jesus' disciples as Muslims. So that means that God was willing to deceive not only non-believers, but also Muslims. And if he was willing to deceive Muslims, the followers of Jesus, how do you know that he's not deceiving you right now? So that's a problem. The third problem that I give is the only test that the Quran gives to know whether it's true is it says, and it says this on several occasions, if you want to know if the Quran is true, then try to write a surah, a chapter, just like one in the Quran, and you'll find that you can't. In fact, you can find all the wisest, best people that you can find and try to construct a surah like this, and you'll find that you can't. And then one of the surahs say, but by the way, if you even try that, you're damned to hell forever. So here's the test, but if you take that test, you lose. But the Quran has 114 surahs or chapters in it. It's not a narrative like the Gospels. It's more like Psalms. They're all independent. It starts off, the first one's an introductory, and then it goes from the longest, they're not chronological, it goes from the longest down to the shortest. So if you look at the last dozen of surahs in the Quran, they're very short. So you can just do a search for the Quran online if you don't carry one in your house. You can do a search for the Quran online, and you can look at any of the last dozen surahs. I mean, all of them would probably take you 5 minutes to read. And just isolate one of them and say, do I think that I could write something as well as this? And I don't care how bad a writer you are in here, I think you could. And a Muslim will be saying, well, yeah, but you got to write it in Arabic because Arabic's the most beautiful language in the world. It's the language of God, and it won't do to do it in English or French or anything. Well, wait a minute. 80% of the Muslims in the world can't even speak Arabic or read Arabic. And does it really come down? I mean, I can make it rhyme. I can put a little rhythm to it like it would be in Arabic. Yeah, but it's got to be in Arabic. So it really comes down to that? Why? Because you think it's the most beautiful language? What if I don't think Arabic's the most beautiful language? What if I think Spanish or French or German? Well, not German. But what if I think one of these are just as beautiful, if not more beautiful than Arabic? Does it really come down to between what I think is the more beautiful language? Is that what it results in? I mean, that's like choosing between Chick-fil-A and McDonald's. That's not a good test. And if it is, since that's the test that the Quran gives, it fails its own test. because I can create a surah every bit as good, if not better, than one of those in the Quran. So there are a number of things that we can say to refute Islam. Buddhism is a little bit different. I haven't studied that as much, but when I did study it, I did see that with Buddhism, historians aren't even sure when the Buddha lived. In fact, if you ask historians of Buddhism, they'll tell you that they don't even know it within a 2,500 year period. They've got an idea, but they're not at all certain when the Buddha lived. And then when you look at the Pali manuscripts, which are the earliest ones of the Buddhist teachings, it says one thing, but then later on, when you read the later Sanskrit manuscripts from the 1st century, they say something a little bit different. You find miracles of Buddha. You don't find anything like that in Pali. So you find this legend that's developing over time. And so there's not a whole lot that we can know about the Buddha. It's not at all like the evidence we have for the truth of Christianity. So that's, in a nutshell, how I answer those two things.
Thank you. I have a German friend here tonight, and I think he's probably offended at your joke, but anyway.
Ich liebe Deutschland.
That's a shout out to you, Kevin. Okay, so a next question. Does doubt come from Satan?
I suppose it could, but I wouldn't say it's all that way. I mean, we're human beings. We have our weaknesses, and doubting can come from a number of things. That's not to say that Satan could not introduce doubt and cause you to doubt, but a lot of it's brought on by those things that I mentioned. Peer pressure from our society, disappointment with God, a poor fatherly figure, things like that. That can all instill, foster doubt in us. But wherever it comes from, there are ways of dealing with it, recognizing that it's normal and dealing with it through the ABCs.
Okay. Got another big question here. Okay, actually, two questions very similar, so I'll read them both in a row. Why do the gospel accounts of Jesus' resurrection differ? Keep in mind that on Saturday night, Mike is going to be speaking on the New Testament. And second, how do you respond to people who say that the gospels are not good evidence because they are just biased, unreliable eyewitness testimony?
Oh man, thank you, whoever that is. Thank you for asking those questions. I mean, this is my current area of research now and has been for the last 8 years. So I can't give a lengthy answer to this because I'm going to refer you to some things. That in terms of the differences in the resurrection narratives, this is something I've really studied at length. And if you want to see a very detailed explanation for these, then just get my book, Why Are There Differences in the Gospels? It just came out. They sold out of them in the first 2 weeks. And it just blew the publisher away. They had no idea there'd be that much interest in it. But they've come out with their second printing. They're out, and I know they have some out there. So I do explain all the differences and assess them. I do think that there are a few differences in the resurrection narratives that I don't know why, what's going on there. I have some suspicions of what may be going on, but I think overall, most of the differences in the resurrection narratives, almost all of them, can be easily explained via compositional devices that were part and parcel of the genre of ancient biography. I don't have time to get into that. I do have lectures on my website, risenjesus.com. I've got 2 lectures on there on differences in the Gospels. So I only get into a few examples, but you can get the overall idea that I'm presenting. So you can look at those lectures. Plus, there's another one when we, I forgot what the second part of that question was, but it had to do with the story, why should we trust the Gospels or something like that. And I have a lecture on my website called the ABCs, D's, and E's of defending the Gospels that you might be interested in looking at. That deals with A's, authorship, B, bias. That was it, bias, right? Bias. But I guess one thing I could say about bias real quickly is bias doesn't mean it's wrong. If we're going to say that bias means that something is historically unreliable, then that means that we could never have a Jewish historian write about the Holocaust. It would mean that we could never have a Cambodian writing about the Khmer Rouge and the killing fields of Cambodia, even though they'd been an eyewitness. We could never have an African American write about slavery in the United States. Well, I would submit to you that the Jewish historian is the very best kind of historian to write on the Holocaust, because they do have a dog in the fight. Because of their bias, they are going to be willing to dig down deeper than perhaps a Gentile historian, because this relates directly to them and their race. The Cambodian writing on the Khmer Rouge, was there, had family involved with the killing fields of Cambodia. And so they're going to be motivated to get down and to tell those stories for the world to know. The African Americans, same thing when it came to slavery in the United States. So bias can actually drive someone to report the truth more accurately and to get more into it. If Jesus was who he claimed to be, if he rose from the dead, then we would expect Jesus' followers to write about these things and to spread the greatest news that mankind has ever heard. It's the greatest news. We would want them to do that. And since they were eyewitnesses of these things, they would be in a position to know what Jesus said and did.
Our next question is about doubt again. Somebody has asked, what role do the promises in Scripture play for you in dealing with doubt?
Well, when I start to have doubts, going to Scripture doesn't help, because that's the very thing I'm doubting, So it's almost like arguing in a circle. Well, why should I believe? Well, because the Bible says. Well, how do you know the Bible's true? Because the Bible says it's true. That doesn't work for me. In fact, it didn't work for Paul either. It didn't work for the Bereans, who had to test things to see what was true, and Paul praised them for doing it. When Peter and Paul were out preaching in the book of Acts, they would say, remember Jesus, he attested himself to you by miracles that he performed in your sight, and he rose from the dead, and of that we're eyewitnesses. And what did he do with John the Baptist? He pointed him to miracles that had been performed that showed that he was the Messiah. He didn't just say, just believe, because the Bible says so. He said, look, here's evidence for it. So, that's not to say the Bible isn't valuable to me. It's really valuable. I love it. I love the Bible. But when I'm doubting, it's not the way I deal with things.
Thank you. Now we have a few more questions on cards, but at the front here, to my left and right, are microphones. And so when we finish the questions on these cards, you can begin to make your way to the front if you like, and we will take questions from the audience at the microphone. Mike, have you ever questioned if God is the creator of everything? And if so, where does evil fit into that? Did God create it?
Yeah, I have doubted whether God's existence. But I am pretty convinced, based on the scientific and philosophical evidence, that God exists. I look at evidence for a designer of the universe and life itself. Things from molecular biology and cosmology. I could get into a lot of this stuff. It's really fascinating. One thing is, you look at the Big Bang, and it was discovered, or seemed to be confirmed in 1964 by a blanket. Two scientists from Bell Laboratories discovered a blanket of microwave radiation in the center of our universe, and from that the universe was expanding, suggesting that a long time ago, that it was very dense and hot there as there was an explosion, and from that the universe came into being. But as scientists looked at that more, they noticed a number of factors that suggest design. So they looked at the speed at which the universe was expanding, and they said, well, if it was expanding any faster, then galaxies could not have formed, and so you wouldn't have any chance of the star-planet relationship that we have with the sun and the earth, which is essential for life, and many other factors involved. If it were expanding any slower, then the universe, the gravitational pull would have caused the universe to stop expanding at some point, and it would collapse on itself in a big crunch, and that would have happened prior to the formation of stars. So then you got to say, well, how much faster or slower, how much fine-tuned is that? And if we were to say within 2 decimal places of 1, that would be 1%. So that would be like 99%, 1 out of 100 chance, but that's not the number. If we said within 3 decimal places of 1, that would be 1 in 1,000 chance. That would mean it's 1,000 to 1 that we wouldn't have life. Or if it were within 4 decimal places of 1, that's 10,000 to 1. Well, the actual number is within 55 decimal places of 1. And so that seems to suggest fine-tuning. And there are about 60 of these factors just like this that suggest the universe is fine-tuned. When it comes to molecular, oh, by the way, so one of the 2 guys who confirmed the Big Bang, his name's Arno Penzias. He's not a Christian, but he made a statement, and I confirmed it with him that he actually made the statement in a personal email back in, I don't remember what year it was, maybe 2000, 2001. I don't even know if he's still alive today, but he said that given what we're looking at here with the Big Bang and this appearance of fine-tuning, it looks like there's a supernatural plan behind it all. And then Francis Crick, an atheist molecular biologist who was one of the 2 biologists who discovered DNA. He said that DNA was so complex, even the simplest of building blocks of life, so complex that it would take it appears that it would take a miracle, even given a 4.7 billion year old Earth. So even Richard Dawkins, a militant atheist, has acknowledged himself that the universe at least appears as though it was designed with life in mind. Now, these guys don't believe that God created, but they all admit that it really has the appearance of design. So it's like if it looks like a duck, walks like a duck, quacks like a duck, it must be a camel in disguise, you know? Is how the atheist view it seems to go. So there's some really good evidence, I think, for God's existence. I mean, and philosophical evidence as well. In terms of the problem of evil, that is a difficult one. I think it's probably the strongest argument against God's existence. Although I don't really think it's an argument against God's existence. The argument goes pretty much that if God is all good, then he would prefer a world in which no evil existed. If he was all powerful, he could create such a world. So then why do we have evil? Is it that he's not all good? Or is it that he's not all powerful? Or is it that he's neither? In either sense, we don't have an all good and all powerful God. And so that's been answered over the years. Probably the most definitive answer has come from Alvin Plantinga, a famous philosopher who retired a few years ago from Notre Dame. And he came up in the 1970s with what's called the free will defense. And he said that when we're looking at all the kind of moral evil in the world, God could have created humans without free will. But you know, he could make us do it, kind of like the Stepford Wives, if you ever saw that movie. He could create us so that he made us, programmed us to love him, but then we really didn't choose to love him. But instead, he created us with free will because he wanted free beings who would choose willingly to love him. And in that case, when you have free beings, you cannot have a situation, a possible world in which all free beings choose to do right all of the time. And so to have a world in which no evil exists would be a logical impossibility, he would say. Now that has been come back by what some have called the Bambi response, and saying, yeah, but there's a lot of other things going on in the world, gratuitous evil, evil that is just senseless. It has no kind of value to it. Like we can say that some pain, evil, and suffering God says that he will cause all things to work together for our good, meaning to bring about holiness in our lives if we allow him to work in that way. But there are some evils that don't seem to be able to do that. It's like lightning strikes in the forest and a tree falls over on a fawn, and when they discover it later, the charred body later on, they found that the fawn tried to chew off its leg to free itself from the burning tree, but couldn't do it and ended up dying a painful death. Well, there was no moral good that came about as a result of that. And so there are some possible situations in which there is gratuitous evil. And so there's all these kinds of things that go back and forth. But at the and people who specialize in this, like Jeremy Evans and David Wood and some others, they've got answers to these kinds of things. But at the very worst, all it would just simply mean is either God was not all powerful or he was not all good. It would call into question the character of God. It doesn't call into question God's existence. But people who have focused on this have come up with plausible explanations for the kind of evil, pain, and suffering that we see in our world today.
Okay, I don't know if this makes me a terrible person, but when you gave the example of a charred deer, I couldn't help but think of your barbecue joke. Now this is a follow-up question. Sorry, it made me really hungry, but okay. This could be taken as a follow-up question. And now, as somebody who's experienced doubt at a very visceral level yourself, I imagine you could experience some sympathy with skeptics, with people who are not easily convinced that the Christian worldview is the true picture of reality. Now, the question is, in your experience, is there one underlying principle or thought or issue that atheists cling to, aside from the obvious that there is no God?
Well, they claim that science is on their side, which is false. They claim that we don't have enough evidence, we don't have good evidence, which is false. I think atheists just have some terrible arguments. So anyway, I'm willing to talk with them. But my thing is, look, if Jesus rose from the dead, Christianity's true. It's game, set, match.
Okay, this is a question of mine, but I imagine that many people here are thinking the same thing because they've shown up to this conference. What advice would you give us when we step out of this church and we go back to our homes or our schools or our workplace, and we have peers who are experiencing those doubts? What would you say is the most important thing? So if you could summarize from your talk or from your experience, what is the key thing to remember when talking to people that have doubts?
Yeah, good question. I'd say love them. Be patient with them. Don't get bent out of shape. If they start to get really nasty and emotional about it, that just shows that they have something that's troubling them on the inside. They've got issues. If you respond in kind, it shows them that you have issues, right? In fact, Paul said in Colossians chapter 1, I believe it's verse 29, he said, "In no way alarmed by your opponents, which is a sign of destruction for them, but of salvation for you, and that too from God." So don't be alarmed, Listen to their stuff. Don't get frustrated. Don't expect to have all the answers, because you don't. I don't have all the answers. And be willing to say, that's a great question. Man, I don't know the answer to that, but I'll tell you what, I think I'd like to go and research that. How about I get back to you in a week and tell you some thoughts that I've developed on it since, and I'd be curious to see let's have an intelligent discussion on this. So have a really good discussion. You always hear, it's an adage, excuse me. People don't care how much you know until they know how much you care. And one thing I heard this morning about JoJo, about how he's dealing with a transgender person in a Starbucks, and how he's been patiently and lovingly working with that person now for quite some time. And that's what you need to do with non-believers. Don't be alarmed. Don't get defensive. Learn your stuff, get some arguments. You don't have to become expert in science and history and philosophy. Gosh, I would say to you, just master an argument for the resurrection of Jesus, because if you got the resurrection, you got God and Christianity, right?
Well, that's a great lead into our last question that I have on a card here. So if anyone wants to make their way to the mics at the front, feel free. The question is, what do you think is the most powerful piece of evidence you've found for Jesus' resurrection?
Okay, well, there's quite a bit of evidence, but the most powerful piece I think I found is Paul. Because Paul was a non-believer before becoming a Christian, of course. He hated the Christian church. He hated Jesus, and he believed it was God's will to destroy the movement that Jesus had started. And then Paul had an experience that he was persuaded was the risen Jesus who appeared to him, and that radically transformed his life from being a persecutor of the church to one of its most able defenders. And by the way, this is what I just stated to you. We have eyewitness testimony from Paul himself in his undisputed letters that even skeptical scholars say Paul wrote. And this is a fact that is granted by virtually 100% of scholars who study the subject, including Jewish, atheist, and agnostic scholars. So Paul was not a disciple of Jesus at the time of his conversion. He went from being a true enemy of Jesus to one of the most aggressive, proactive, effective leaders and propagators of the Christian church. Moreover, despite any hesitations one may have about the Gospels, we can establish Paul knew the Jerusalem apostles, had met with them, had run the gospel message past them that he had been preaching, and we can confirm historically we have 3 different ways of doing this, and historians look for outside corroboration and all this, so we can put together 3 arguments to show that Paul was preaching the same gospel message as the Jerusalem apostles. So when we hear Paul in the resurrection, we are likewise hearing the voice of the Jerusalem apostles, that Jesus died, was buried, was raised, and that he appeared to both individuals and in group settings. And we get this from Paul. So even if we did not have the Gospels, we've got Paul, who claims to have been an eyewitness of the risen Jesus, who knew Jesus' disciples, got information with them. We can confirm he's preaching the same thing they're preaching. And we can also confirm from numerous sources that Paul suffered greatly for his faith and died as a Christian martyr, which attests to the sincerity of his faith. So Paul's pretty strong, and it's the thing that skeptics have the most trouble dealing with when it comes to the resurrection.
Okay, thanks for that. So now we're going to move to the mics, and I'm going to start on this side, and then we'll alternate back and forth.
Awesome, thanks. Mike, I love your ABC method of dealing with emotional doubt, and I think it's super applicable, especially for most of the first world problems that most of us probably experience. But it's hard to get away from the fact that there are many problems which you just can't put a positive spin on. You think of the killing fields like you mentioned, or the Holocaust. So can you talk a bit more about how you deal with those A events which you can't just put a B positive spin on, and especially maybe just how you deal with a friend who's maybe just gone through something which, from our perspective, is just impossible to gain a handle or any kind of positive spin on?
Yeah.
Thanks.
Well, I mean, we can just say that life does suck at times, doesn't it? It just is nasty, and bad things do happen. In terms of the Holocaust, you know, I've thought about that some. On my 50th birthday, I was over in Germany, and my wife and we were over there with Mark and Heidi Mittelberg and their son and daughter, and spending some time, and they said, "What do you want to do for your birthday?" Big day, 50th birthday. What do you want to do? And we were in Munich, and I said, I want to go to Dachau. I want to go to the Dachau concentration camp. I'll never forget it. They said, "Why would you want to do that on your 50th birthday?" I said, "Because I'll never forget it." And I went there, and it was just the most sobering day of my life to see the stuff and learn about the stuff that had happened at Dachau. And you got thinking about that, you know, why would God allow something like that? And what would something that haunted me then, that haunts me to this day, what would I have done had I been a clergy then? You know, if I come out and speak against the Nazis, I'm going to be put in a camp like Dachau. And speaking against the Holocaust isn't going to do any good. It's not going to do anything. And so all it is going to result in is misery in my life. Plus then my family won't have any income coming in. It's going to hurt them. And you could justify not doing it. It's like, well, I don't know what I would have done. It haunts me. But I get thinking, well, why would God allow something like that? And I remember talking, we had a fix-it man. I am not a fix-it man. I can't do anything. I mean, nothing. And my wife teases me about that. So we got back from Germany, and we had a fix-it man come over immediately to fix some stuff, and he was a Jewish guy, and he said, "So what do you think about the evil that happened over there? Doesn't that disprove God's existence?" And I said, "Well, not really. He said, why not? And I said, well, let's just say God doesn't exist, okay? So I was talking to someone, maybe you're in here, I think it was yesterday, where you had some chickens and a raccoon came in and killed all the chickens, you know. And so that was something that happened that put you back, and you'd say, well, but was that a moral evil? And you'd say, no, it's, you know, I feel sad for the chickens, but, you know, the raccoon, it's just nature. It's just what they do. It's not really evil that he did that, you could say. Well, if God does not exist, then what makes what Hitler did to the Jews any worse than what that raccoon did to the chickens? You know, it's just nature, right? Survival of the fittest. There's no right and wrong. I mean, we could invent morals, but it doesn't mean that something is really right or wrong. It just means we've said that we're not going to do this so that we can live more at peace. But there's nothing intrinsically wrong with what Hitler did in killing the Jews, gypsies, homosexuals, and all of that, we'd have to say. Nothing intrinsically wrong with that in a godless reality. So it's more difficult for an atheist to deal with the evil than it is for the Christian. But then I would look at it and say, well, okay, well, how would I deal with it? Well, number one, it does seem to suggest that objective moral values exist, and that cannot exist apart from God's existence. So that's one thing I'd say. Another thing I'd say is we don't know the plans of God, but we could say this. That was the cusp of the nuclear age. And what if there was a despot like Hitler and this genocide that was taking place had happened hundreds of years, or even just 100, or even 50 years before? It would have taken place, and there's nothing anyone could have done about it, and it would have continued, and, you know, we would have remembered it, and there's not much else we could do. What happens, though, is it was on the cusp of the nuclear age, and we were able to defeat Hitler. What if Hitler had those bombs before us? And we might all be living under a Nazi regime today. Things might be really different. So God has his timing and everything, and it may be that he put it just then, Hitler doing this to the Jews, and allowed it to happen just then, so that we would come in and destroy Hitler before he could get nuclear bombs, and it wouldn't be forgotten. It'd be like, we can never allow something like this to happen again. But it would have had to have been at that particular point in history. So God may have allowed something super evil to happen to avoid even worse evil in the future. So, I mean, it's pure speculation. That's all we can do, you know. But that's some of the thoughts that I might have about something like that.
Okay, we'll move to this mic over here.
Hi, Mike. Hey, thank you so much. Enjoyed the presentation and your time. Champion, especially being sick. I just wanted to, something I've just been thinking through the past couple of days. James 1, I think 35, 36, says something to the effect of, if any among you is sick, let them call the elders together and pray for them, and that the prayer of faith will in the name of the Lord will actually heal that person. So this seems to provide a litmus test of sorts for the truth of at least the Bible's credibility, that if that person isn't in fact healed by sincere prayers of faith by the elders, that Christianity would be false. I'm wondering how this kind of thing could be squared with someone, you know.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So I guess stay at that mic.
Yeah.
At the mic. So I might say to you, all right, it seems to me that you're making a big leap by saying, let's just assume for a moment that James got it wrong, all right? I mean, I think we could have some answers for that, all right? But let's just assume worst case scenario and James got that wrong, okay? Why would that merit the conclusion that all of the Bible is wrong or discredited?
I think it would just poke a hole.
It would poke a hole.
Yeah.
Would it poke a hole in the entire Bible or just in James?
Yeah.
Remember, Martin Luther didn't even want to include James in the New Testament.
Oh, really?
Yeah, he said,
because it talks about faith without works is dead. And so he was all about faith, of course, not works. And I think he misinterpreted James on that, but he said, I don't care if it was Jesus' brother, he's not preaching the right gospel, and so it shouldn't even be in the New Testament. So, I mean, you could respond and say, okay, well, that's some false teaching in there. Worst case scenario, it's false teaching. It shouldn't be in the New Testament. It's not like Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John said, hey, let's put together the New Testament and include the letter of James because it's totally credible. No, that came centuries later. So if James got it wrong, it wouldn't mean that the whole Bible's wrong. It might have meant that in the process of canonicity was wrong, and part of James was wrong. But there might be some answers to that with James. I mean, there are instances, I know of people who the elders have come and laid their hands on people, and they have been healed. Now, there have been times when that has happened and they're not healed. And why God chooses to heal sometimes and he chooses not to heal on others, I don't know. It doesn't bother me so much. Like I said, next month I'll have been married 30 years, and I very honestly, sometimes my wife says and does things and I don't understand why. And I've lived with her for 30 years, and she'll tell you that sometimes she does things and she doesn't understand why she does them. So if I can't understand my wife, who I've lived with for 30 years, I'm not going to get all bent out of shape if I don't understand why God does something, the creator of the universe, why he does something and not does something. But I don't think that would disprove the Bible. At the very worst, it would just mean we got a problem with James.
Okay, so would we refrain from praying a prayer of faith for fear of looking bad in a public place? Let's say we're in the middle of the mall, someone drops dead, and we pray a prayer of faith that God is going to heal them loudly in the name of Jesus Christ. Would you advocate for refraining from such a thing?
I probably wouldn't do that in the mall.
Okay.
I'll just be honest with you. You think, when I was in college, someone who had a PhD in theology, I just thought they knew everything about the Bible. And then as you work yourself in the education process, you realize that even now, as someone with a PhD in New Testament and studies these things, there's so much that I will never even get to when it comes to the New Testament. I focused on the resurrection, and I'm focusing on the historical reliability of the Gospels. I focused on gospel differences. There's so much more I could study in reference to Paul's letters and things. I haven't even gotten to James. So there are people who have written commentaries on James. So if, I would encourage you to check out some academic commentaries on James to see what some primary scholars are saying about it. Check out Dale Allison's commentary on James in the ICC commentary series. If you have Logos, it just came out in that recently, and you can get it fairly inexpensively. It's a good commentary. Peter Davids, one of the best in the world, used to be one of my colleagues at HBU, probably one of the top 3 scholars in the world on the book of James. And I would want to go to his commentary on James to see what he has to say on that. So I'd want to probably look at 5 to 10 really, really highly respected commentaries on James to see what these very highly respected scholars are saying on how to interpret that passage. Because there might be some things linguistically in the cultural milieu that would shed light on what was meant there that would lead me to interpret it differently than I might on face value reading it in English.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so we have time for a few more questions. So to this mic over here.
Hi there. So the topic of doubt just made me think about doubting Thomas, because he's probably the most well-known doubter in the Bible. And it just seems like in this case, God is really praising people who don't need that evidence. And he says, because you have seen me, you have believed. Blessed are those who have not seen me and yet have believed. So I just wanted your perspective on that.
Yeah, good question. Well, he didn't really rebuke Thomas. He just said, you can be blessed, more blessed, if you haven't seen and yet believe. But Jesus provided evidence to John the Baptist when he doubted. Again, the apostles always referred if you just read the book of Acts and their sermons, they always would refer to Jesus' miracles and his resurrection as evidence that Christianity is true. So I think maybe the equivalent today would be demanding that the risen Jesus appear to us before we'll believe, rather than looking at the evidence. And, I've run into some inveterate skeptics who I've said to them, I get the sense that even if Jesus actually appeared to you and said, here I am, see, now believe, that you still wouldn't. He said, that's right, I wouldn't. I still wouldn't believe because I still have questions and he's got to answer them first. I think, wow, that's just, you got to come to God on his terms and not on your own terms if you're really seeking. And God doesn't necessarily make it easy for us. In fact, in Acts 17:27, he says Paul says he wants us to grope for him. Think of a blind man who's just feeling around for something on which to anchor himself. God wants us to grope for him, seek for him fervently. And something for us to keep in mind is God isn't just looking for someone who's going to believe and just pray a prayer and walk away. He's looking for disciples, because even the demons believe and tremble at that. I think sometimes we can make it a cheap grace. We present a gospel that Jesus didn't preach, and we focus on the faith and stuff, but faith, I think, is more than just believing. Faith in the New Testament is what scholars like to refer to as speech act. You confess it, but you also mirror that confession with your life. I think of the rich man who came to Jesus, the rich young man, and say, teacher, what must I do to have eternal life? And Jesus said, well, you know the commandments. Do not murder, do not commit adultery, do not steal. And the young rich man said, well, I've done all these since youth. And Jesus said, well, there's one more thing that you lack. Sell everything you have and give to the poor and then come follow me. And the rich man didn't want to do that because he had a lot of possessions. And he walked away sad. Now notice what Jesus did not do there. He didn't say, hold on a second. I just teasing. I'm just testing you on that. Look, just come on back. You don't have to give all out. You can just grow into that. Look, just come before me, kneel, pray this prayer, and you'll be saved from hell. He let the man walk away. Jesus is not just looking for people who will pray a prayer and say, I believe in you, and affirm him. He's looking for disciples who will be all out, sold out for him, on fire for him, willing to give their lives for him. That's what he's looking for. And he does not make it easy for us. And we shouldn't expect him to. So it's a great question.